So what drew you to this topic?
I've been interested in bullying for a few years, and it actually started with not a teenager story, but with a story about a mother named Lori Drew, who had a daughter who had a friend named Megan Meyer, and the girls were kind of on again, off again in their relationship. And Drew has been accused of setting up an account, like a fake Facebook account for a boy, teenager named Josh. And it's not clear who exactly did this, but somebody used the account to kind of bait Megan and make her kind of increasingly upset. And then shortly after fake Josh sent her a message that was really cruel, she committed suicide. So it's sort of a weird thing because it's like the origin story of cyberbullying. It led to a lot of legislation, but it's actually not a story about teenagers. It's a story about a mom.
What is it about this topic that everyone thinks they know, but everyone's got wrong? A lot of what I'm reading about your book, and I haven't read it yet, but I'm going to get on it. A lot of what I'm hearing about the book, and when I flip through it, I see is you sort of busting kind of emerging myths and preconceptions that people have about a bullying epidemic or the way bullying actually functions in schools or the way it works.
Right. Well, this idea of an epidemic has really been out there. And I think it's because of news coverage of stories, often stories about suicides, actually, where there's this temptation to draw this really straight cause and effect line from meanness to a teenager's decision to take their own life. But there's a way in which the media has kind of blown up these stories that I think has really scared a lot of people and made people feel like bullying has kind of gotten out of control in a way that's different from previous generations, even though I don't think that's really the case.
It does. I've said many times that it's not. I don't think as simple as take a healthy kid, add bullying, you get a suicide. But bullying certainly seems to have been a contributing factor or a trigger in a lot of cases. And it certainly isn't helping a kid who may be vulnerable or have other issues.
That's right. And it's also true that there's particularly this problem of triggering and contribution often in suicides involving gay teenagers. And I think one of the reasons for that is something you talk about a lot, which is that in those cases, the bullying is kind of part of this whole hostility and social rejection that a lot of gay teenagers are still facing. So there is this harassment. I really think in those cases, harassment is a better word because bullying can kind of trivialize the experience in a sense. But the
Hmm.
harassment is layered on to other problems kids are facing, maybe at home or maybe a general feeling of hostility from the culture around them.
One of the cases that kind of got a black and white presentation in the media and take a healthy kid, add bullying, get a suicide was the case of Phoebe Prince. And you dedicate a large part of the book to unpacking that and kind of complicating that story and making it grayer. Um, was that a difficult thing to report? Was that a difficult thing to do when you approach somebody who's become kind of a martyr in the anti-bullying movement and complicate the public picture of that person?
Yeah, I mean, there were definitely things that were hard about that. I got into that story with the same set of assumptions as everyone, which was to assume that there was this pack of kids who were just creating this terrible environment at Phoebe's high school and had really bullied her to death. I mean, that was what the news coverage said, and eventually the district attorney. And what happened was that as I started going to that school and talking to kids, that just was not their impression. And I don't want to say that it was all a lie because that's not true either. It was just more complicated. They felt like the kinds of things that happened to Phoebe on the day of her death, she was called a slut in school, and that was upsetting to her. Those were things that it wasn't a good thing about the school, but they were kind of common. And so what was really uncommon was Phoebe's reaction. And Phoebe did have this complicated mental health history. She had attempted suicide previously, and she had a history of depression and of cutting. And none of that history was part of the original reporting. And so it was really talking to the kids at the school and then other people in the town, parents, teachers, administrators. It was their kind of deep sense that the news stories and all of the sensational coverage just didn't match what had actually happened. That was what really pushed me into that.
Do you worry about blame shifting though? Because part of that, I think, narrative can be then everybody goes through this, bullying is normal, and oh, this kid had other issues, depression, cutting, substance abuse, and so this kid, because of all these other issues that are that kid's fault or that kid's family fault for not addressing if they weren't being addressed, that kid was, pushed over the edge by bullying, maybe. But if that kid has been as healthy as every other kid who's endured their fair share of bullying, they'd still be here today. Is there a danger of shifting the focus and the blame to the dead who aren't in a position to defend themselves?
Yeah, there is. So here's how I think about it. Because suicide is usually such a complicated, multifactorial phenomenon, I think it just does a disservice to everybody to oversimplify it and draw this straight cause and effect line. Because then we're not going to get the right kind of suicide prevention services. We're not going to get the interventions that really help kids.
And what are those interventions? Writing this book and doing all this research, what are those interventions that can help save a kid's life who may be bullied?
Right. So, I mean, this is like the huge question that we all face, and there isn't one simple answer. I mean, part of it is straight up mental health services. And one of the most depressing studies I've seen recently is one that shows that a lot of teenage suicide victims actually have been in counseling. They're just not getting very good counseling. Instead of pointing the finger in this very simple way at one mean kid or one set of mean kids, to take a step back and say, like, okay, what really happened here? Forget blame. Let's just think about the ways in which the culture of this school or this community contributed to making this child unhappy. And what do we need to change? Like, what are the things about this environment that proved to be toxic? That's like a big cultural project that a lot of schools and communities need to take on.
One of the things that's always, as a gay person involved, in the creation of the It Gets Better project and the anti-gay bullying angle, one of the things that I've always found very kind of revealing, when people talk about bullying now, they always say it's 24/7, potentially because of Facebook, because of Twitter, now Instagram, follows the kid home. There's no respite. Home isn't this refuge. A kid who's bullied at school used to be able to go home and there would be peace. And that kid now goes home and there's Facebook. And the tormentors from school can reach literally into the kid's bedroom or phone or pocket or bed in the middle of the night and bully that kid there. And as a gay person and in contact with a lot of like young gay teenagers who are suffering, for me that didn't seem like anything new, because for gay kids the bullying in many instances has always been 24/7, because gay teenagers are often bullied in the home too. And schools, paradoxically, for a lot of gay kids are the refuge. School is the place where they're safe from their parents, where they may have some kids that they're out to. I don't know where I'm going with this or what my question was. I had one when I started. But you went to Facebook and talk to them about what they're doing. Are the social media companies responding in a responsible way to try to address this power of social media to turn basically every bullied kid, gay or straight, into that gay bullied kid who's tormented in the home as well?
I would say yes and no. Facebook in particular is working on the responses they send to kids after kids report abuse on the site, so posts and photographs that they have a problem with. And I think the response flows that they're called, that Facebook are developing, they're better. They're really trying to encourage kids to turn to people they already know and trust for help, which makes sense because those are the people that understand the context for whatever the like really mean thread or ganging up is. That I think that's very sensible. The other side of this, though, is the social media sites have a lot of power over kids. They have done internal studies showing that when they send a note to a kid saying like, we're going to take away some of your privileges on this site because of what you did, or just take this down because it violates our rules, kids hop to it. They start behaving themselves better. One of the things I did in my own reporting was just to make it a habit of asking teenagers, would you rather be suspended from school or from Facebook? They are very invested in their Facebook profiles. That's something they care about. And so, Facebook has more power to sort of do good and push kids to behave well than it is using.
They can make "don't be an asshole" a term of service.
Exactly. There is a term of service like that. Facebook explicitly prohibits bullying and harassment in a way that actually Twitter does not. And so it's sort of setting itself up as the police. Facebook is not a place where there's just the First Amendment and all speech flies. It's like the mall where a security guard can throw you out if they don't like what you're saying. So once you've set up those kinds of rules, then I think the site really has a responsibility to take them seriously. And I think Facebook wants to build brand loyalty with kids, and so they don't want to do things that make them seem uncool. Another thing they could do, and really have, I think, not done enough of at all, is to work directly with schools. But, the idea of being associated with like the typical authority figure at a school, that's not something that company seems eager to embrace.
There was just a suicide in Oregon, this 15-year-old out gay kid And this will be the last question. I'm just curious, like, what your advice to a parent would be in this situation, because I've certainly had my say and given what I think is my best shot at what I would advise. But this kid had begged his parents to homeschool him, and he was not happy at school. And this is not the first time where I've heard of the suicide of a gay teenager who had asked to be homeschooled and wasn't being homeschooled. My advice to parents, parents get into this thing where they don't want the bullies to win. They don't want to pull their kid out of school. That'll seem like a victory for kids who may be hounding a vulnerable kid and persecuting a vulnerable kid. But I do think that at some point you have to err on the side of perhaps allowing the bullies to win and getting a kid out of a toxic environment. There are some schools, as you profile in this book, some schools are toxic and administrators don't address problems. And parents, I think, have to step in at a certain point and rescue a kid from a school like that, even if it means being secular homeschoolers. Homeschooling, it's not just for right-wing Christian fucknuts anymore. What would your advice be to a parent in that situation?
I agree with you. I think there are two levels. There's your kid and rescuing your kid, and I don't think it's letting the bullies win to take your kid out of a situation in which he's being relentlessly harassed every day. Nobody needs that in their life, and sometimes you just can't control a situation like that, and you just have to take a break from it and start somewhere new. You know, in my book, one of the characters is a girl named Monique, and she was out of school for an entire year because her mother felt like her middle school was not a safe place for her. The superintendent balked at switching her. And so she was kind of stuck. It seemed to me that if her family had had more money, they could have sent her to private school. And to me, there was something quite unfair about the whole situation in a class sense. You know, the second level of addressing the kind of anti-gay hostility you're talking about is to change the culture of the school. And gay-straight alliances have been really shown. There's really good research that suggests that they're a buffer against bullying. But that's a more medium to long-term solution. And if you have a kid who is suffering, I think you have to do anything in your power to help them. And often that can mean just removing them.
Emily Bazelon is a senior editor at Slate and a contributing writer at the New York Times Magazine. She just wrote her first book, Sticks and Stones: Defeating the Culture of Bullying and Rediscovering the Power of Empathy and Care.